Temperature zones. In this video, scientists will understand how latitude affects temperature. Let's start with latitude. Latitude is simply a measure of the distance north or south of the equator. You've probably heard of the equator. It's that imaginary line that goes around the middle of Earth. Now, as you start traveling towards the North or South Pole, the latitude starts to increase. The equator has a latitude of 0 degrees, and as you start moving towards the poles, you start increasing the latitude. Here's a map of the Earth broken into latitude and longitude, which we'll cover at a later date. Right now, look at the right side of this map, and you'll notice the north and south latitude going up and down the map. Let's try an example of reading the latitude on a map. First, there's the equator, which has a latitude of 0 degrees. What about location A? If I read across from that point, you'll notice that it hits 50 degrees north. That's the latitude of location A. Let's try another. Location B, again, if I read across until I hit the axis, has a latitude of 10 degrees north. Finally, location C. Again, reading across to the right-hand side, we'll notice that location C has a latitude of 60 degrees south. Next, let's talk about temperature. Oftentimes we think about temperature and how it feels outside. The air might feel hot or warm or cool or cold. Now, we're also very familiar with talking about Fahrenheit. If I was to say it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside, you would know that that's incredibly hot. Also, if I said it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, you would know that's very, very cold. However, in science, we use degrees Celsius. It's simply another way of measuring temperature. You'll notice on the thermometer on the right, both degrees Celsius and degrees Fahrenheit measure temperature. However, if you're unfamiliar with degrees Celsius, it can be hard to figure out what the temperature is saying. So here's a handy way of breaking it down. When it feels hot outside, it's about 30 degrees Celsius. When it's warm, it's around 20 degrees Celsius. When it's cool, you're down to 10 degrees Celsius. And it's cold when it reaches 0 degrees Celsius. These demarcations are incredibly important and will become very handy as we go through this unit, so make sure that those are in your notebook. Now, why do we have different temperatures on Earth? Well, we know that all the heat energy on Earth comes from the sun. However, different areas of Earth get more sunlight than others because the Earth is curved. And what that does is it creates differences in the heating of Earth. Near the equator, the sunlight is direct, which means what it sounds like. The sun is directly overhead, and that is incredibly hot sunlight. Picture walking outside on a hot sunny day. The sun is overhead. It's directly overhead, scorching down. However, as you start moving to the northern latitudes or the southern latitudes, as you move away from the equator, sunlight becomes indirect or spread out. The same sunlight is spread over a much bigger area, and therefore it feels cooler. Again, picture walking outside on a winter day. The sun is out, but it doesn't feel as hot. That's because the sunlight in winter is indirect. Now, because some parts on Earth have direct sunlight and some parts have indirect sunlight, that creates differences that we call temperature zones. And in fact, there's 3 temperature zones based on latitude. The first zone is called the tropical zone. It's the part of Earth that's very close to the equator. Moving away from the tropical zone, you get into the temperate zone. And finally, very far away from the tropical zone, you get the polar zones. Let's start with the tropical zone. This is the region of Earth near the equator between 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south. Anything within that area is in the tropical zone. Now, the tropical zone gets direct sunlight all year, and because it gets direct sunlight, areas in this part of Earth are warm or hot all year long. Summer is hot, fall is hot, winter is hot. Temperatures normally stay between 20 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. The opposite of the tropical zone is the polar zone. These are the parts of Earth far from the equator, normally 66.5 degrees to 90 degrees north and south. You might know them as the North and South Pole. These areas of Earth get indirect sunlight all year, so the sun may come out, but it doesn't feel very warm. Because of that, the polar zone is cool or cold most of the year, so temperatures 10 degrees Celsius or colder. In between those two extremes, we get the temperate zones. These two zones sit in between the tropical and polar zones. Now, during the summer, temperate zones get direct sunlight. But in the wintertime, they get indirect sunlight. And that means that summertimes are warm or hot. So summertimes have 20 degrees Celsius days or hotter. Whereas the winters tend to be cool and cold, so 10 degrees Celsius or colder. So in the temperate zones, it's cold in the winter, hot in the summer. And you might be thinking, yeah, Baltimore is in the temperate zone. Now there's one important thing to note. The seasons in the north and the south are actually flipped. So while June through September is summer for us here in the north, it's actually winter down in the south. And that takes us to our key ideas. First, latitude is simply a measure of the distance from the equator. Next, sunlight is most intense near the equator, or the most direct near the equator. And finally, because sunlight is different, we have 3 temperature zones on Earth.